Just about now, we're commemorating the 10th anniversary of the death of Eqbal Ahmad, who, along with his close friend and mine, Ed Said, was the most eloquent spokesperson here for Palestinian rights. Eqbal was also perhaps the most outstanding commentator and analyst of revolutionary nationalism generally. Had plenty of direct experience in Algeria and elsewhere. He was also quite close to the Palestinian leadership, and he and Ed Said for many years tried to persuade the Palestinian leadership that they were fighting a losing game, that they should undertake nonviolent struggle, which they felt, and I agreed, could succeed. Eqbal in particular sketched out various courses that it could follow. Well, unfortunately, in my opinion, their advice had no impact, and the predicted consequences you can see. At the same time, however, there have been developing nonviolent alternatives on the ground in the occupied territories. For the most part, they've been crushed by violence. Some, however, have had a degree of success and can expand. The most significant of them, I think, are the struggles around the village of Bilin against the separation wall. It's, in fact, should be called what it is. It's an annexation wall. That was clear from the beginning. It's by now virtually official. The annexation wall is a criminal enterprise. It's not debatable. It was reaffirmed by the World Court a couple of years ago. In fact, with the agreement of the U.S. Justice in a separate declaration. So it's a criminal enterprise. The struggle against it is, of course, completely legitimate. And it's being carried out with limited success, with thanks to the assistance in large measure of a number of courageous Israelis, Anarchists Against the Wall being the most important group. There are others as well. Among them is Nobel Peace Laureate Myreed Maguire, who was shot and gassed by the Israeli army a couple of years ago, participating in nonviolent demonstrations against the wall, an act which aroused no interest here. It's our problem. A serious problem. And it leads to a few obvious reflections, familiar ones I'm sure, about nonviolence. It can be very effective, but there are prerequisites. One prerequisite is visibility. If it's not seen, then it's not going to work. A second prerequisite is an appeal to the humanity of the oppressors. That's essential. You couldn't have carried out nonviolent resistance against the Gestapo. In particular, you couldn't have done so if there were no media there, no information about it. It's easy to identify the oppressors in this case. All we have to do is look around. We're the oppressors, the primary oppressors. The guns happen to be in the hands of the Israelis, but they come from here. The bulldozers that you saw come from here. The F-16s that were smashing Gaza to pieces come from here, all being used in violation of U.S. law and, of course, international law. But if the population here is quiescent, the crimes will continue. And without the decisive diplomatic, military, economic, ideological support of the United States, there would be no annexation wall. In fact, there would have been a political settlement, not an ideal settlement by any means, but better than what exists, better than what is to come, and very possibly, even likely, a stage towards a much better arrangement for the people involved and, in fact, for the region generally. However, that can't happen as long as an appeal to the oppressors and the humanity of the oppressors is not heard and is not acted upon, and the source of that is primarily right here, which is a good thing in a way. It means we should be able to do something about it. The form of a short-term political settlement, is very well known, not controversial. There's been a very broad international consensus about it for over 30 years. It's a two-state settlement on the international border, pre-June 67 border, the recognized international border, with minor and mutual adjustments, the terminology of official U.S. policy until the middle 1970s. That solution is supported by essentially everybody. It's supported by Europe, the non-aligned countries, Hamas, Hezbollah, Iran, the majority of the American population. In fact, it's hard to find an exception, except two, the U.S. government and Israel. Those are the exception. And since the U.S. government is basically the master of the world, that means it doesn't happen. This issue, again, our problem. The issue came to the United Nations Security Council in 1976, January 1976. The resolution was proposed by the Arab states, supported by the PLO, calling for exactly that, political settlement on the international border. It could have been refined, it could have been modified, but the two rejectionist states wouldn't allow that. Israel reacted to the calling of the UN session by bombing Lebanon with no pretext, but plainly an attack, just a denunciation of the United Nations, killing over 50 people. It was reported blandly in the United States, not very interesting. The US responded by vetoing the resolution, which is quite normal, since the UN fell out of control by the mid-1960s after decolonization and the reconstruction of other industrial societies. The US is far in the lead in vetoing Security Council resolutions. Britain is second. Nobody else is even within shouting distance. Whole range of issues, pretty much the same story in the General Assembly. When the US vetoes a resolution, it is actually a double veto. One is it doesn't pass. The other is it disappears from history. That's the task of the intellectual community, to make sure that these things disappear, and you'll have to look pretty hard even to find a reference to it. A similar resolution was vetoed in 1980 under Carter. Won't run through the story because there's no time, but it persists until the present being our new president, Obama. His first official declaration on January 22nd was it accompanied his appointment of George Mitchell to be his mediator in the Middle East. And Obama is an intelligent person. He chooses his words carefully. You should attend to what he says and also to what he omits. And he was very explicit. He said that our prime responsibility, of course, is the security of Israel. And he said there are some proposals. He mentioned one. He said there's a constructive proposal, the Arab League proposal. And he said that the Arab states should pay attention to it and should proceed to normalization of relations with Israel. Well, in fact, that is called for in the Arab League proposal as a corollary. The content of the Arab League proposal, which Obama, of course, knows very well, as do his handlers and advisors, is simply a reiteration of the international consensus. The Arab League proposal called for a two-state settlement in the normal terms, which the US and Israel have unilaterally blocked for over 30 years. And in that context, in the context of a two-state settlement, it calls for moves towards normalization of relations with Israel. Okay, Obama scrupulously omitted the core of the resolution, the prerequisite for moving on to normalization, and simply advised the Arabs that they should be forthcoming and move towards normalization of relations with Israel. As it stands now, radically opposed to the core of the Arab League proposal, as is the United States. Couldn't have a clearer statement. that Obama is dedicated, probably even more than his predecessors, to extending the rejectionist U.S. position, which prevents a political settlement, hence the first stage, necessary first stage, in my opinion, towards moving on to something else. Okay, that's where we stand now from 1976 until 2009. The rejectionism, extreme rejectionism of the U.S. and Israel, it is partly in words, not just in this case. So last December, the United Nations General Assembly had a long series of resolutions. As usual, they weren't reported. There's a good reason for that. A well-behaved newspaper is not going to report a resolution on regulating the arms trade, which is passed overwhelmingly with 2 negative votes. The United States, as is normal, not Israel this time, Zimbabwe. So the U.S. was joined by Zimbabwe in opposing that. We're not isolated. And a number of series of other resolutions. One of those that wasn't reported was a resolution calling for recognition of the national rights of Palestinians. Okay? It was passed, I think, 173 to 5. The 5 were the United States, Israel, and 3 invisible Pacific islands, Palau, some of those that aren't yet underwater. So, of course, you can't report that. The words are actually pretty explicit. Ehud Olmert, the departing prime minister, gave an address to a joint session of Congress in May 2006, had rousing ovations when he said that the historic rights of the Jewish people to the land of Israel are beyond question. So we have total rights, meaning nobody else has any rights. Rousing ovation. He also, about the same time, announced his plan, which was treated here as very moderate. It was called his convergence plan. It was later abandoned as too moderate. The convergence plan essentially called for annexation of everything within the annexation wall. That's some of the most arable land in the country. It's the nice suburbs of Jerusalem and Tel Aviv. It happens to contain the main water resources, which are very crucial. It included the Jordan Valley, which, as you saw, is about 1/3 of the territory. That imprisons whatever's left, and then come these salients that cut through. The one east of Jerusalem was constructed mostly during the Clinton years through the town of Ma'ale Adumim, intended to bisect the West Bank, which, if you look at the map, it effectively does. And then there's 2 northern salients, which cut the center from the north. And then there's these hundreds of checkpoints, which you heard about, arbitrarily placed in various regions, essentially to make life unlivable. So that's the words. The deeds are, of course, far more important. The deeds are the constant, regular implementation of the plans. It's far more significant than the words. Well, you saw a picture of some of them in the town of what's going to be the Israeli settlement of Efrat, which the Israeli government, for interesting reasons, called Ephrata, which you noticed there, but putting aside that, it's Efrat, which is a town between Bethlehem and Hebron. It's intended to kind of tighten the encirclement of Jerusalem so that Jerusalem's now a huge area of the West Bank, annexed in violation of Security Council orders. This essentially helps encircle it. And if you read this morning's paper, you discovered that yesterday Israel announced that it's tripling the size of Efrat. Thousands more people come in, trying to turn it into a town the size of about 30,000 people, and it'll go on from there. So these things are happening every day. In fact, during the attack on Gaza, when attention was focused on destruction of Gaza, Israel used the opportunity to expand the settlements throughout the West Bank. As far as Gaza is concerned, I won't talk about it, but the goal there was not simply to kill, however many it was, 1,400, more to come, because many of the injured die, but just to destroy the society. So a large part of the agricultural land was simply destroyed. bulldozed by huge bulldozers, not the little one that you saw there, but the huge ones that are kind of, the familiar phrase, making the desert bloom, just as you saw. And also to destroy what there was of a manufacturing industry, almost all destroyed. The goal is to make this cage in which Palestinians are to rot, to make it unlivable. You've got to ensure that you do that. So you wipe out the arable land, you destroy whatever there is of manufacturing, maintain a siege. A siege is, of course, an act of war. No one insists on that more than Israel. Israel has twice gone to war, 56 and 67, largely on the pretext or grounds, if you like, that its access to the outside was hindered, very partially. A siege is much more than partial hindering. In the background are important issues like natural gas discoveries off the coast of Gaza, but can put that aside. So that's Gaza, to be crushed. The West Bank is to be turned into an extended version of what you saw on the map. The bulldozers are a major weapon of mass destruction. Apart from just shooting people and so on, they're the prime means for destroying the land and turning it into what the U.S. and Israel want it to be. You may recall a week or two ago, Obama went to Illinois, and he wanted to show his solidarity with American workers. What plant did he choose? Well, the Caterpillar plant. That's where he gave his talk, showing his solidarity with the people who are criminally assaulting Palestine and destroying it. And the word criminal should be emphasized. He's a lawyer. He knows it's criminal. Israel was informed in 1967 by its top legal authorities, quite well-known international lawyers, that these are criminal activities. They recognized it, decided to proceed. The U.S. for a couple of years objected, now supports it and implements it. So again, we are the oppressors. And this is going to continue as long as we allow it to continue. Is there a possibility of reaching a two-state settlement? Well, here I disagree with a lot of people. I think there's a very simple possibility. In fact, it came very close not long ago. It's worth remembering. There has been 1 week in the last more than 30 years in which the U.S. put aside its rejectionist stance. That was a week in January 2001, Clinton's last month, when he permitted, he didn't expedite, but permitted negotiations in Taba, Egypt, between the highest level Israeli and Palestinian negotiators, and they came very close to a solution. In fact, at their last press conference, they said if they had a few more days, they could have reached a solution in terms of the broad international consensus with specific details about the various side issues. Well, that was the negotiations were called off prematurely by Prime Minister Barak of Israel. But though a lot has happened since 2001, I don't think anything has happened that makes that impossible. The basic situation remains effectively the same. Now, it is commonly argued that it's impossible. In fact, one of the most persuasive and eloquent discussions of this that I've seen, or to be more precise, read the transcript of, was by correspondent Bob Simon of CBS. A very good correspondent, knows the area very well, has lived there, accurate. And he, if you saw it, he gave 2 standard reasons why it's impossible. But I don't think either reason is correct. His first reason is that the only options now, with all the construction and development, are that either there'll be a 2-state settlement or Israel will be an apartheid state like South Africa, in which case you can have a civil rights struggle and maybe a successful outcome. That's not going to happen. The option that the United States and Israel are pursuing is a third option. It's the one that's taking place right now. It doesn't turn Israel into an apartheid state. It turns it into an Arab-Rhine state, a state free of Arabs. So in the West Bank, the areas that Israel wants, for which the U.S. provides the means and the support, will be completely Jewish. There'll be huge highways, superhighways for
Israeli settlers, for tourists. There'll still be an Arab population, but they can be kind of wandering up in the hill somewhere. In fact, that's maybe the Israeli Tourist Bureau will even subsidize them. It'll be nice for tourists, racing along the superhighways to look up on the hill and see an old man pulling a goat. Maybe they'll even rent a camel or something like that. And it makes it look like a biblical landscape, and, it'd be terrific. The American tourists will love it. So they'll leave them up. Of course, there are other people there, so they can starve, or they can rot, or they can leave, or something. But that's the goal for the West Bank. And it's being implemented. As I said, it's in words, but it's also in deeds. What about Israel itself? Well, they have a problem there. They have a 20% non-Jewish minority. So the natural idea is one which, indeed was proposed by a highly respected Harvard professor 35 years ago, Michael Walzer, a great humanist and a socialist, who said that nation building is a difficult proposition, and those who are marginal to the nation should be helped to leave. Since we're humanists, we help them to leave. Okay, so the Arab population in Israel is marginal to the nation, so you can draw the conclusions for yourself. Well, at that time, that was an applauded position on the U.S. left. In fact, he's the editor of the Democratic Socialist journal Dissent, but it wasn't really implemented. It has been proposed recently within Israel by the ultra-right Avigdor Lieberman, who's now the kingmaker in Israeli politics. When he proposed it, his proposal was explicit. Not that you kick them out, not that you help them to leave, but you redraw the boundaries. So that, take a look at demography inside Israel. There's a region, Wadi Ara, right, which happens to be heavily up in the Galilee, which is heavily populated by Arabs. There's a big town there, Al-Fahim, and you could draw a boundary which forces that population into what you're going to call a Palestinian state. Of course, you don't ask them. They're just what are called Arabushim. That's the equivalent of kike or nigger. So the Arabushim, you just push them into the third world. Maybe they would like to live in a rich first world country where they are now, but we'll put them into some derisory Palestinian state that can barely exist. And then you get rid of a good part of the Arab population. Well, that was considered neo-Nazi when he proposed that a couple of years ago. It's now a centrist position. That's the position of Tzipi Livni, the hope of the doves. Either help them to leave in the Walzer sense or redraw the boundaries. And I think you will see that proposal will be accepted in the United States by liberals as a very forthcoming proposal. In fact, it's already happening. A couple of days ago, the New York Times correspondent, Ethan Brunner, had an article in which he was talking about the elections, and he said that Lieberman's position, though considered kind of neo-fascist, nevertheless has elements in it which are attractive to the left. One element that's attractive to the left is, in his words, that Israel will yield territory. He didn't tell you how it's going to yield territory. The way it'll yield territory is by forcing the non-Jewish citizens of Israel out of the country, against their will, of course. So that way it'll yield territory, very attractive to the left. We can all applaud the forthcoming solution. Well, pursuing these means, Israel can hope to be Arab Rhine, no demographic problem, and to take whatever it wants. That's the third alternative. Neither an apartheid state nor a two-state settlement. And that is what is going to develop. It's developing before our eyes. It's now moving to the center of becoming a centrist, even in Brunner's terms, a leftist position. And I think we're likely to see more of that. The other argument that Bob Simon gave, which is true, but in my opinion irrelevant, is that if Israel tried to force the settlers out, there would be a civil war, which is probably true, but not to the point. It's true because the army is now, to a substantial extent, including a lot of the officer corps, religious nationalist extremists. And yeah, they probably wouldn't follow orders. In fact, many of them say the orders of the rabbis are more important than the orders of the state. So yes, it would cause a civil war. But it's irrelevant because Israel doesn't have to force the settlers out. If the U.S. compels them, if the U.S. shifts position and agrees to a political settlement, Israel is compelled to go along. And all they have to do is announce that on such and such a day, the Israeli army will leave the West Bank. 2 weeks before, probably 90% of the settlers will climb into the trucks that are provided for them and move from their subsidized homes in the West Bank to subsidized homes in Israel. Maybe some scattering will remain, mostly religious Jews from Brooklyn. Well, okay, if they want to remain under Palestinian Authority, that's their choice. Nothing more has to be done. The evacuation of Gaza could have been done exactly the same way, but it was quite important to stage a trauma, a national trauma. So you'd have front page pictures of a little boy pleading with the soldiers not to take them away, cries of never again, all a cover for extending settlement in the West Bank. Great propaganda operation, worked very well in the West, Boston Globe and so on. Totally unnecessary. All that was necessary to when Israel decided that keeping a couple thousand settlers in Gaza wasn't worth it was just what I said. Announce that on August 1st, the IDF leaves, and then everybody picks up and goes. Quiet, but it's not a national trauma and doesn't give you a justification for further occupation and settlement. So I don't think either of those arguments works. In fact, I don't know of any argument that works. It's within reach. It's an ugly settlement. I've always been opposed to it all my life. I'm still opposed to it. But I don't know of any other way to go on to something more viable. And it is within reach. What matters is whether the U.S. will accept it, whether the oppressors, that is us, will allow this to happen. If it doesn't happen, I think you can pretty well predict that the fate of the Palestinians will be the same as the fate of that hapless race of Native Americans that we are exterminating with such merciless and perfidious cruelty. I'm quoting John Quincy Adams, long after his own major contribution to those hideous atrocities was over, and right at the time when they were continuing in full force and went on for years after. We simply have to decide whether we want to lament what we have done in this case too, long after it's too late to do anything about it.